are struggling with their children. Some are struggling with life, with employment, with their faith. Lots of different things we're seeing, but God's blessing us, and we're able to minister to more and more people every year through that ministry. I think in the strategic plan they're working on, they're even looking at expanding the counseling because the need is just so great, especially for Christian counseling. So, with that, that's my little bit of introduction. I might tell a little story for the 10:30 service. I might not. So if you don't hear it and you want to ask the story, I'll tell you after church. We'll go through that. Well, so my disclaimer is that, there was a miscommunication, if you will. And I didn't find out that I was teaching Sunday school until Friday. And I might have known, though. The miscommunication very well may have been on my part. I mean, Jim might have sent me something 2 or 3 months ago and said, would you do Sunday school in church? But I didn't have that, at least in my mind. And so when I got the call about the introduction on Friday, he said, I'm going to introduce you at Sunday school and in worship. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. Am I doing Sunday school also? And they said, did we fail to tell you that? So anyway, I'm glad to be able to teach Bible study this morning, although it may feel a little bit more sermonish, if you will, because that's what I had with me. And so to adapt that to a Sunday morning class was not that difficult. So I would just say in closing about the children's home that Satan's alive and well. And as long as he'll be here until till the end. We're going to have challenges. Families are going to struggle. And children are going to struggle. And somebody's got to be there to minister to them. And so I'm just thankful that they let me be a little bit a part of that still. And let me encourage where I can encourage. Well, the title of this morning's class is The Power of Example. And I wonder how much time we really think about that, how much we think about our example, and really how that influences people that we come in contact with every single day in every aspect of our lives. I found 4 individuals that had interesting things to say about the power of example. The first one's name is Anne Sophie Swetchheim. And she said this, there is a transcendent power in example. We reform others unconsciously when we walk uprightly. That was pretty good, right? Albert Einstein said this, I'm only coming to Princeton to research, not to teach. There is too much education altogether, especially in American schools. The only rational way of educating is to be an example. I don't know if I buy all of the education components of that, but he makes a strong point. Edmund Burke said it this way, example is the school of mankind, and they will learn at no other. And then finally, John Balguy says it this way, whatever parent gives his children good instruction and sets them at the same time a bad example may be considered as bringing them food in one hand and poison in the other. Pretty powerful, isn't it? And so on one hand, we're challenged to be an encouragement, but on the other hand, we might not show them the same thing. It's not unusual. I speak all over the Southeast, and it's not unusual. When I shake people's hands out there and I say, how are you? Everybody's doing great. Everybody's hand that I shake is doing great. Are they really doing great? Are all of them doing great? Nobody ever has an issue. But I understand we put on our Sunday morning face for each other. And we smile and we say we're doing great, no matter. Because we're proud people, I suppose. Maybe we think nobody cares. But our example, our encouragement can go a long way in helping people. The concept of the power of example is deeply rooted in biblical teachings, which emphasize the influence that we have and can have on others with our actions and with our character. The Bible provides many instances where the conduct of one person served as a model for others, which really highlight the importance of others watching us all the time. But before we go any further in the lesson, I wonder if you could think back in your life of somebody that set a powerful example for you. Somebody that really helped set the trajectory of your life, if you will. In a previous lesson that I taught here, I talked about my grandmother. And my grandmother being the matriarch of our family. And it was my grandmother that would take my mom and my aunt to church every Sunday morning. And my grandfather encouraged that, but he never would go. And so there my grandmother went with two little girls. And so it was my grandmother, though, who set the example for my mom and my aunt. And then ultimately, my grandfather became a Christian because of the long-term influence of my grandmother. And then my aunt and my mom became Christians. And then my cousins and my siblings became Christians because of the example of my grandmother. But I didn't tell you in that lesson about a young minister that moved into my community that was in his 20s, who kind of took me under his wing. And when I was in that volatile 14, 15, 16-year-old age, he'd just call it like he saw it. He just put his arm around me and said, "Boy, it's time for us to take a walk." And he encouraged me and later baptized me and later married my wife and I. And then later married my daughter and her husband. What a powerful example he was in my life. I didn't tell you about a young couple who took over our youth group and made it fun. And our room was painted, the walls, and it was fun. And yet they taught us through devotionals every week. And so they were successful in balancing fun and balancing spiritual things. And what an influence they had on my life. And again, I want to ask you, who had that influence on your life? Who encouraged you to believe? Who encouraged you to have values and to love Jesus? To see something that you really wanted to know. Now, some of us grew up in the church where we were drugged by our ears every time the doors opened, right? And so that's what we did. And yet statistically, the kids that grow up in the church like Kim and I, if they don't have at least one significant relationship with somebody outside of their nuclear family, the chances of them staying faithful goes down, down, down. You see the power of example. and getting involved in people's lives. The Old Testament lays the groundwork, if you will, for understanding the power of example. And so we see that through the lives of the patriarchs and the prophets and the leaders. And I won't have time this morning to go through all the stories in the Old Testament about people that set wonderful examples for all to follow. And yet, before I tell you about some of them, not a single one of them was perfect. They all made mistakes. Well, let's talk about young David. We find the story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. And you remember the story, right? David's just a little shepherd boy who's out and takes care of a very small section of sheep when his brothers are called to war. And you remember the one day that Dad calls in David and says, I want you to go check on your brothers. I want you to take them some food, and I want you to take some for the captain of the group. I just want to know that they're okay. And so David goes, and he arrives in time to hear Goliath, right? And I kind of hear it like this: fee, fi, fo, fum. But I don't know exactly what Goliath said. I mean, the Bible says some about that. But Goliath taunted the Israelites. He taunted them and said, send anybody. Send your best. Nobody went. And they were all scared. Well, you know how the story ends. I mean, the story ends with David saying, I'll do it. And Saul saying, you're too little. You can't do this. But nobody else volunteers. And so he dresses David up in all that armor that he can't wear. Finally, he takes it off and gets the smooth rocks. And what kind of example do you think David set for that entire group of soldiers? Well, his brothers were probably embarrassed, but you bet everybody else was thankful because they saw their lives flash right before them, I imagine. And so the power of David's example crept through all of that, and for generations, and even today, we're encouraged by David's example, are we not? David wasn't perfect. We know some of his mistakes, right? And we don't have to talk about all those today. But by and large, David set a good example for those to follow. Well, what about our brother Abraham? He was often cited as the model of faith and obedience. We find in Genesis 22 his willingness to sacrifice Isaac at God's command, which really demonstrates a strong trust, a profound trust in God. And he set the standard, the example, if you will, for future generations. I've often said when I tell that story, I would not have liked to have been Abraham after God said, Abraham, it's time to go in to his home and tell Sarah. Would you have wanted to tell her, it's time to sacrifice your son? It's time for him to go. You remember the deal. We talked about it. And yet Abraham showed faith. What an example he set for everyone who saw what was happening here in Genesis 22. And even today, I don't know about you all. I mean, sometimes I think I'm the guy that has the faith of a mustard seed, because I pray that God never asks me to sacrifice one of my children or one of my grandchildren. And I want to hope that I would step up and do exactly what God wanted. But I can't imagine. But Abraham did. Because that's what he promised God he'd do. And what an example he set. Well, what about Moses? Moses might be one of the greatest men to ever live other than Jesus. And Moses' leadership and his humility are really exemplified in Numbers 12, chapter 3, where he's described as a very humble man, more so than any man on the face of the earth. Moses' life serves as a template, an example for leadership, which is grounded in servitude and a reliance on God. Moses wasn't perfect, was he? In fact, when we first kind of see Moses come on the scene, if you will, we see him murdering somebody, right? And you might say, well, he was justified. Look at what was going on in that situation. But based on the fact that Moses kind of snuck around in all that and tried to hide it, you got to know he knew it was wrong. And yet God used Moses. God used Moses to carry the message to the Israelites, to take them to the promised land. And he set such an example for those to follow. And even today, we think about the story of Moses and we think about, that long journey that he moved an entire nation and then not being able to experience the promised land himself because of a mistake that he made. And yet, I suppose if we could read between the lines, Moses probably acknowledged what he did that was wrong, that kept him out of the promised land. He knew better, but he still set an exceptional example for all of us to follow. Well, so that's the Old Testament, and those are three of a lot of stories in the Old Testament. And we find through the Old Testament that some people's example was really bad, but they still set an example. And some people's example was really good, but they set the example. And so as we go through the second half of this lesson, I want you to think about that, because you have no choice but to set an example. If you're living and breathing and going outside of your house on any given day, you're going to set an example somewhere, whether you're fighting for a parking spot at Walmart, whether somebody cuts you off on the highway or somebody jumps in front of you. We went to see the Savannah Bananas last week at Clemson. Their largest crowd in the history of the Savannah Bananas, 81,000 idiots like me, came out to see the Savannah Bananas. And it was fun. It was a one and done. I'll probably never go see the Savannah Bananas again. But it was fun watching the examples that they were even setting for the children. I'm a people watcher, and so that's what I did. I watched people at the game. And where I was going with that story was, I got in line. Well, first Kim got in line to get our grandchildren a hot dog. So we'd already spent $52 getting them a Pepsi. And so now we're on to get them a hot dog. And Kim was in line, and I walked up to read the board. And this lady just bellered at me. And she said, "Are you jumping in front of all of us?" And I said, "No, ma'am. I was just reading the board. I'm going back to my spot." And so it crossed my mind, you know, she got little bitty kids there. And she's just being ugly for no reason. I didn't really want a hot dog that bad. In fact, my poor wife waited in line for a half an hour and got to the front of the line and they wouldn't take cash. How about that? She came back, smoke coming out of her ears. And I said, I'll go get the hot dogs. I'll go wait. And so that's my story of the Savannah Bananas. But the example that this lady was setting for her children, I just thought, where's the example of grace? Where's the example of mercy? I know you're hot, and I get it. And I'm really not cutting in front of you anyway, but if I was, I must have a really good reason. Like the little girl that we took with us fell out from heat, being in line that long to get in the stadium. So other people around were so generous, and they came and poured water on her and helped out, and that was great. And see the example they set. We're going to set an example. That's my point. And some of them are going to be good, and some are going to be bad. But our model in the New Testament is obviously Jesus Christ. He's the one that ultimately stands as our example and the example for all believers to follow. His life and his teachings are a perfect model for love and humility and obedience to the Father. You know, I don't know how much time you all spend thinking about Jesus. I spent a lot of time thinking about Jesus. And the mystery, you know, is what Jesus was doing that 30 years or so, right? Are you not curious kind of what he was doing? I mean, we kind of know that when he's 12, we find him in the temple, right? And he's setting an example right in the temple because he's setting an example always. But then we lose him from 12 until 30 or so. You wonder what he was doing? I mean, I guess he was making tenants. But because he already had the wisdom, because he showed it at 12, right? That he already knew the law and the teachings and what God wanted shared. So you got to imagine, I mean, he was encouraging people, even though he didn't start the ministry of preaching. You got to believe if he was building a tent, he was the nicest tent maker there. If he was a carpenter, like his dad, he would have probably been the best carpenter, right? And the kindest carpenter. And when he hit his thumb with a hammer, he probably didn't say what some of us might have said, other than just ouch. I can imagine that Jesus was setting that example all of his life of being a good person, being a person interested in following the will of the Father. In John 13:15, after washing the disciples' feet, Jesus states, "I have set you an example so that you should do as I have done for you." This act is important because it shows his humility and his selflessness, and it speaks to the power of example because he's telling the folks he's talking to in John, the disciples, go set this same example of humility, of humbleness, of being willing to wash the feet of a person that so desperately needs that. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21, it reminds believers that Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his footsteps. You probably didn't know there were that many references to example in all the New Testament, but they're all through the New Testament. And Jesus is talking about that to his disciples. But how about the apostles and the example that they were called to set during their lives here on earth? The disciples just followed Jesus around, and once in a while they'd ask him a question or they'd banter back and forth, but I think their job was that kind of deacons to help Jesus get what he needed in order to share the ministry that he was called to do in that final few years of his life. And yet they were learning. They were listening. The Apostle Paul frequently encouraged believers to imitate his conduct as he imitated Christ. Look at all that Paul went through in his life. Look at the example that he set. But did he always set the best example? Well, I mean, we know what Paul's early life was like, right? He did what I no doubt believed that he believed was right. And yet we wouldn't want any Christians to follow Paul's example early on, would we? Before he had that whole road journey where he went blind and was touched. But later, Paul's example is incredible. And who can imagine going through what Paul went through with all those shipwrecks and stonings and imprisonments? Oh my goodness, his life just went on and on and on, didn't it? And yet, as far as we know, Paul stayed faithful through all that. Paul says, of all the apostles, I was the least of them. And yet he wrote most of the books of the New Testament, right? Most of the letters were written by Paul. And so what an example he set for all of us to follow. But what about Peter? Peter set a pretty good example, didn't he? Especially after the resurrection. Because you remember Peter's kind of ornery at that Last Supper, isn't he? In the upper room, and when Jesus is washing feet, and what did he say? Not me, Lord. You're not washing. Not me. You can skip right over me. And Jesus said, you don't understand. You don't understand what I'm doing. And if you want to end up where you think you want to end up, you're going to let me do this. Now, obviously, that's my paraphrase. And then Jesus tells him what? You're going to deny me 3 times. Not me, Lord. I won't ever deny you. Jesus said, you'll deny me by tomorrow. 3 times. And he did, right? And yet, it appears that Peter learned a great deal that day and in the days following. Because we're just hours before Jesus' death here, right? And so, Peter learns a lot and becomes one of the great ministers of all time. In fact, in Matthew 16, Jesus asked the disciples who they thought he was. And Peter said, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, the son of Jonah. For this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but my Father in heaven. And speaking to Peter, Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my church. Upon this acknowledgement, Peter, that I am the Messiah, the the Son of the living God. I'm going to build my church on that confession, on that reality. You see, some of our I'll say friends of other religious groups, they think the church was literally built on Peter, right? That it was literally, and that Peter was the first pope, and that you know the whole story, right? Since but the Catholic Church just appointed a new pope this last week, and so all that comes down, right, from, they say, Peter being the first pope. And that's where they take that from, that passage there. I don't think that's what that means. I think it was based on Peter's confession back there when he said, who do people say I am? And I think that it's that confession that you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That's what the church was intended to be built on. If you have a different opinion, please let me know that, but that's what my study somewhat concludes. And so what a powerful example Peter must have set for Jesus to do that and say that. But again, he wasn't perfect. Paul wasn't perfect. But they both became great teachers and great messengers to all who would listen. Well, the New Testament emphasizes the power and example through church leaders. The elders or the overseers are called to be above reproach, setting a standard for the congregation. What does that mean? Well, that means their example, right? Their lives, the lives that they live currently. Now listen, you could argue that nobody's life is above reproach because we're all sinners and fall short of the glory of God, right? You could argue that. And yet I don't think that's what the writers are saying, that you have to be perfect to be an elder. I think it just means that you don't need to be actively scandalous or involved in things, not a gossiper, not a cheat, not a liar. Somebody that people look up to. They don't look up to you because you're perfect. They look up to you because you're wise, because you're godly, because you're trying, you're striving every day to walk with Jesus. And so they have a tremendous responsibility, don't they? 1 Peter 5:3 says leaders are instructed to be examples to the flock, highlighting the responsibility and the authority to lead by example. And being an elder is an important calling. And you have to be prepared to shepherd. Sometimes folks that may or may not really want or think they need to be shepherded, and yet that's what God calls you to do. He calls you to be a shepherd and set that example. Well, what about the rest of us? What about us as individual believers? Are we called to set a good example for people around us, or even encouraging each other? Every believer is called to be an example, reflecting the light of Christ in a dark world. In Matthew 5, verse 16, Jesus instructs, "Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." In 1 Timothy 4:12, Paul exhorts Timothy to set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. Which demonstrates that in almost all the aspects of our lives, we're called to fill in one of these boxes, to set the example for those around us, for them to say, I want to know what it is you know. I admire you as a parent. I'd love to come to church. I want to learn about what it is that you know. Because I want to know the same thing. Because you seem different. Matthew clearly tells us to let our light shine. Paul is clearly telling Timothy to set a good example for believers in everything that he does, in every way he talks, in every way he behaves, in every way he loves, that he needs to show faith and purity to those around him. And I'm sure that if Paul were here today preaching this sermon, number one, it'd be way more eloquent. Number two, you wouldn't quit at 9:15 because Paul just keep going, I think, until he ran out of energy. But I think Paul would say, you don't have to be perfect, but you got to be conscious of how others are interpreting your actions and your behaviors. And are they seeing Jesus through you, through your kindness, through your benevolence, through your compassion for each other, for the love that you share with all those around you? John Piper said that man is made in God's image, that we as Christians are to reflect God in his world. He says that God designed us to imitate others as a means of imitating him. I have a friend in Texas, and I text with him almost every day, or he texts with me, or we talk all the time. And when I talk to him, and by the way, he had terminal leukemia, and it should have killed him in a year. And I think he just celebrated his 10-year anniversary of not having leukemia. But boy, it was a rough ride. He had the worst possible kind of leukemia. I mean, it would have killed him in record time. And he went into a test program in Seattle and stayed a year. And now it's the standard for that particular. But it's messed up all kinds of other things in the same time. But he's happy and he's active in church, and he just turned 70 last week. And invariably when I call him, I say, Brian, how are you? And he'll say something snarky about how he is. And then I'll say, are you behaving yourself? And he says, Robert, I always behave myself. Always. Sometimes it's good behavior. Sometimes it's bad behavior. But I'm always behaving. Why to really chew on that for a minute? It's not that was so deep or thought-provoking, but I did think about that. Even as I prepared this sermon this morning about example. You are going to set an example. And sometimes it's going to be positive and sometimes it's going to be negative. But hopefully the positives far outweigh the negatives. And people are watching. And some of us come to church every time the doors are open, and that's really good. And some of us give to the church generously and give to charities like Southeastern Children's Home generously. And that's great as well. But day in and day out, what are our kids saying? What are our grandkids, our friends, our work colleagues, our neighbors? What are they seeing day in and day out? Are they seeing smiling Christians? Are they seeing the chosen frozen, so to speak? Are they seeing us at our worst possible moments? Are they seeing us really walking the walk? Are they seeing us encouraging and being benevolent and volunteering and being compassionate? What are they seeing? I'm going to close with a story this morning, and I'm about 2 minutes over, but it might be worthy of a closing. I have a lady that I'm seeing weekly in counseling, and she's been married and divorced twice. She grew up in the church, and her dad's about to pass away. And she's so incredibly angry at him. She cares for him every day, but she's so angry. And she said, I can't reconcile myself. She said, the worst day of the week. She said, by the way, we were there every time the doors opened for church. And remember at the beginning of this lesson, I talked about our Sunday morning faces? Well, that's what her family did. They put on their Sunday morning face. And she said, I grew up hating Sundays. My dad was so mean after church on Sunday because he anticipated going back to work on Monday. And he was mean to us. And she said, he ran his own business and he lied to people. And he wasn't an honest business guy. And she said, I just don't know what to do with that. He was mean to my mom. He's still mean to my mom. She said, that everybody that came in contact with him at church, he was the guy up there. He was the guy leading the prayers and doing the Lord's Supper and teaching Sunday school classes. He was the guy. But when he left, what the kids saw was something very, very different. And so she said, can you help me work through my feelings? And so we're several months into that. I encouraged her to find peace with her dad before he died, and she said, I don't know what to say. Whatever I'd have to say would be negative, and I don't really want to do that in the final days as he takes his final breath. And I said, well, what if you wrote him a letter and could really express all your feelings? She said, I just mourn for the father I wanted, not the father I got. And so the power of example is, it just keeps going. And we have to be conscious of that and the influence that we're having on those around us, because it's the only way we're going to grow a church. It's the only way we're going to help people find their way to the foot of the cross, is by setting that example. But it's not easy. And when you fall down, you have to get back up. You have to go back to the foot of the cross on your knees, and you have to say, God, please forgive me. I can't believe I got so angry over that, or I got so frustrated, or I just didn't exemplify what you would have me exemplify in my life. God, forgive me. And then get up and go smile and go hug somebody. Go write somebody a card or an email. Because, people don't really send cards too much anymore. They just send emails or text. I could do away with all of that. But do something for somebody else. And so if your motto every day is, I'm going to do something for somebody else today. I'm going to set an example for somebody else today. One person every day. Surely we could all call or text or encourage one person every day, so that they may want what you want and what you have in your faith. Well, our time is up. And so hopefully this has been helpful to you today. Think about the examples that were set in Scripture, but none more important than Jesus Christ and the example that he continues to set for us every day. See you in a few.